Geeks and geekettes, cats and kittens, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, comic book fans from across the globe. Here's where you get to ask a seasoned comic book professional like me, in fact, it is me, questions about what he does for a living. And what I do for a living is I create comic book scripts. I write comic books. I sit here and make stuff up all day long. How lucky am I? My God, I'm put here finally in place to do what God apparently built me to do. Since comics are just in my DNA, I love writing them. I like storytelling. I love working with artists. I just dig the whole medium. I'm here to share my enthusiasm and my knowledge and my years of experience with you, as well as apparently more and more you just want my opinion on stuff. Okay. Comics Gatekeeper 9746. You mentioned Denny O'Neil's more realistic take on Batman on occasion. Are there any of the more wacky elements of the Batman mythos you would like to have used? For the most part, I was down with Denny's approach to Batman to avoid the more comic booky superhero elements, because Batman had had enough of that. Especially through the late 50s, early 60s, when they virtually turned Batman into a science fiction comic. He was going to other planets and aliens, dealing with aliens and people from the future and traveling through time. And then we moved into the campy era as inspired by the 1966 television show. And Denny wanted to leave all of that behind and get Batman back to his golden age roots. Just sort of throw all that stuff to the curb and start over again. And I was down with that, so he avoided the more science fiction-y, as he saw them, villains. Although I really dug Mr. Freeze, even though Denny had me kill him. And then I brought him back, which made Denny angry. He was a little miffed at me because he thought we had seen the last of Mr. Freeze. But the good thing I did bring him back, because the animated show really gave Mr. Freeze a story, made him a far more interesting character than he had been before. And I didn't see him as terribly science fiction-y, because he was extending his life by lowering his heart rate and breathing rate, basically keeping himself in stasis. I thought, that's at least somewhat scientifically possible. Man-Bat, on the other hand, is pure universal horror story and not created by Denny. Created during Denny's period, but Denny wasn't the editor then, so I had no choice. It was created by Frank Robbins, and but I like Man-Bat. I think Man-Bat's cool, and I like the kind of horror element that it brings to Batman. So I was given special dispensation to use Man-Bat because I explained to Denny how I love the character. And again, Man-Bat was used quite effectively in the animated series, which kind of opened the gates. Then he kind of had to say, okay, well, if they're going to use him in the cartoon, I guess we're going to use him in the comic book. I don't remember any exact meetings about this. It was just sort of an understanding that since they were in the cartoons, it made sense for them to be in the comic books. And given that a lot of Batman's roots are in Dick Tracy, particularly the villains, Mr. Freeze and Man-Bat are a good fit for Batman, I believe. As far as wacky elements, I was more a logistics guy. I was more like, how does Batman work? How does he function? What's the deal with the Batmobile? What's the deal with the cave? How does he keep this life secret? Because, Batman's he's got a big footprint. His carbon footprint's big. Got that big old car and all the stuff he uses. And I assume he has to, to some degree, heat that Batcave. That must be a whopping electric bill to run those computers. But, and that was things I like to think about, like his computer. What kind of computer would he have? And he had a Cray computer, big old mainframe computer down there in a cold room under the main part of the Batcave. That his computer, the Bat computer you see, is only basically the CPU of a much larger, more muscular mainframe computer. and things like the belt and all the different stuff he would need. And his adaptability to different costumes he would wear. I mean, he must have a winter weight costume and a summer weight costume. I introduced camouflage costumes, because those were being introduced through the toys anyway. As I've said many, 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 many times, my favorite Batman story ever is the strange costumes of the Batman. So I was into putting Batman in all these different outfits that made sense according to the mission. So it wasn't really the wacky elements. I wanted to get into the more realistic elements. But, like the Batboat, Graham and I really wanted to do a Batboat, but we couldn't figure out how to make that work. How does Batman, where does he get down to the marina? Where does he keep a boat? That seemed a little much because a boat can be followed. I mean, a boat can only go so many places. You can assume with the Batmobile, he can lose whoever's behind him. But a boat, that's going to be harder to explain. And where does he dock it? And eventually, when we did Bane Conquest, we came up with the idea of the Bat Submersible, which is something we had discussed when we were both on Detective, that there would be an underground, a subterranean lake as part of the Batcave complex that had an outlet to the bay, the harbor, or a river, so that he would be able to have a submersible boat that he could directly leave the Batcave and then pop up in Gotham Harbor wherever he wanted, and it'd be nearly impossible to follow, since it would be like a two-seater submersible. That would be tough to follow even with sonar. Another imponderable was the Batcopter. Graham and I agreed the Batcopter was totally impractical. The explanations in the original Batman comics about where he hid this thing was in a barn on the Wayne property. But again, a copter is easy to follow. It's hard to land a copter without anybody knowing you landed it. So we avoided the copter. The only time I went for the Batcopter was when I did Batman Predator 3, because Rodolfo DiMaggio was my artist, and Rodolfo loved drawing choppers. And so I forget how I did it, but Batman manages to get a hold of and customize an Apache helicopter and use that against the Predator to give him a little bit of an edge, because they needed a bit more of an arsenal to go up against what turned out to be two Predators, not to spoil the surprise of the story for you. Now, yeah, there's some wacky elements in Batman, and the guy who liked handling the wackiest was Alan Grant. And then he let Alan do whatever he wanted, which was a good idea, because Alan could make this stuff work. So Alan loved the crazier, zanier elements of Batman, and was really adept at making them work. So he was allowed to do Batman. He also did Clayface, which character I only used once. I very recently, actually, I wrote a Catwoman story a couple of years ago with Kelly Jones art, and Clayface is the bad guy in that story. But there was a time when they wanted to do, because he was being reintroduced to the cartoon, they wanted to do an arc in Legends of the Dark Knight featuring Clayface, and it was proposed that Kike Alcatena would draw it. And I thought, wow, that's going to look great. I said, but I'm not really into Clayface. Alan would do a better job on that story than I would, because he's into that. He would do a much better job, and I was right. I mean, so as much as I would have loved to have worked with Kike in yet another Batman project, I thought Alan was a better fit. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of screwy stuff with Batman, but you got to keep a balance, and you also got to make sure that it all makes sense within the Batman universe's own internal logic, that this stuff is for real. I mean, you got Killer Croc, characters like that, are pretty comic booky, more superheroic or more horror element, or more horror oriented. But it all depends on the handling, the presentation, if you can make it work. A quick Airboy question. Did the age difference between Val and Davey ever give you pause when you're developing their relationship? Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of discussion about what do we do. We got Davey. He looks just like his dad. All these years have passed, and we have Val being brought out of, Valkyrie being brought out of suspended animation directly from the final days of World War II, or at least the early 50s. And she wakes up and it looks like her old flame, her old romantic interest, Davy's right there in front of her. But it's not, it's his son. But that doesn't seem to stop her. She's drawn to him, and eventually they become a romantic item. And when you think about it, it's a little odd. The dad's no longer there, and she falls for the son. But remember, no time has passed for her, and to her, there's no difference between. She can see no difference between the son and the father. And of course, there's a few years age difference between them. She's the older woman, the femme fatale. But in reality, because of her long sleep from World War II, there's, she's old enough to be his grandmother as far as we can, if we consider how long she's been on the planet. Although much of that time, she's been asleep. So, but the thing is, it was Eclipse Comics. So what the hell? Eclipse was like, swing for the fences. Let's go crazy. So we just went for it. And because it would have, I don't know, I guess there were other ways to play this, but to reintroduce Val and her to be like a mother figure to Davy, that just didn't seem to work. And the very controversial nature of their relationship drew a lot of eyes to the book. Yeah, maybe a little perverse, but that's comics. They're a little perverse. One thing I'm proud of, though, is that there's a movie called Comic Book Villains made in 2002. If you've never seen it, it's a lot of fun. It's a heist, basically a heist movie or a con artist movie involving a comic book collection, a golden age comic book collection. And the movie opens with two characters in a comic shop discussing this very subject and how effed up it is. And I was kind of proud of that. That's something that I wrote made enough of an impact on someone that they included it in a screenplay. So, and it's a funny scene. And it's overall a fun movie. Although at the end, if you're a real comic book collector, it turns into a bit of a horror film, if you know what I mean. Dan Donovan, in Ask Chuck Dixon number 145, you talk about how adult Western TV shows like Rifleman came about because the audience who had been fans of Westerns as kids had grown up during World War II and actually participated in World War II, more to the point, and now wanted more adult fare. It struck me that this parallels superhero comics in many ways, with one huge exception. While Westerns left characters like Roy Rogers and Lone Ranger for the kids and didn't try to turn them into adult characters, DC and Marvel have taken exactly the opposite approach and turned characters like Batman into ones that are completely inappropriate for children now. Why do you think comic book creators took this approach while creators of Westerns didn't? Well, because the creators of the TV Westerns in the 60s were creating new characters. They weren't trying to reboot established characters like Lash LaRue or the Durango Kid. They were creating new stuff. Specifically for an adult male audience. So that's the difference. They didn't just return to the stock characters and try to grow them up. Whereas DC and Marvel are kind of, that's who they have. That's who they have to deal with. And rather than create, there's been attempts at both companies to create more adult characters and more adult lines, but they've generally failed, other than Vertigo. They generally fail to catch on. And so they do the easy thing because they're not very creative. They just grow up the characters that are there. Now, back when I was a kid, comics were for kids. Now, adults read them, but merely as distraction. I never met an adult comic fan when I was a kid. But like my Uncle Bobby read them. He was an adult, and he read comics. He would buy a big bag of comics with the covers ripped off at our local drugstore, and there'd always be a stack of comics in his room. When he was done with them, he threw them away because that's the way people read comics back then, and which horrified me. Comics are primarily for kids, and the characters created to appeal to these readers were created to appeal to kids. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, they were for children. Yes, we can look back and say the creators added a certain level of sophistication to them and all the rest. There's a good reason for that. Kids can't be pandered to. Kids are a tough audience. You got to have your shit together to write for kids. And Ditko and Kirby and all these people understood that. All the greatest comic creators, Jack Cole, C.C. Beck, Ando Binder, which is actually two people. They understood that you couldn't just phone it in for kids, or kids can sniff a loser and they wouldn't buy the comics. So they, Carl Barks, John Stanley, they worked hard to entertain these children with fare that was reading fare that sometimes challenged the kids. So what both comic book companies, and when we talk comics, we're generally talking DC and Marvel. What they were stuck with was characters created for kids, and then they tried to grow them up. Now, as I said, comics used to be for kids, which meant you outgrew them after a while. Except for fans like you and me, who continue to like comics, even past the point where all of our friends gave up reading them. We were the minority. The majority of comic book readers stopped reading them sometime in middle school, right? They might pick up one now and again, but they got out of the comic book reading habit. And what happened is their younger brother or, cousins or whatever, came up behind them. So every few years you had a turnover of readership, and the comic companies were aware of this, and they would, keep things fresh or do soft reboots or whatever. But they knew that the comics were being read within a certain age range, and they kept the material that way. Now, in the 80s, when the direct market comes along, now the comic book companies are working to appeal strictly to the core fan base. People like you and me who didn't outgrow comics. We didn't outgrow anything. We just didn't grow up. So people with Arrested Development was the core audience for the comic companies now. And they were, and they weren't interested in the overturn audience anymore. They weren't interested in the kids. They weren't going to pander to them anymore. They were going to grow the characters with their audience. And that's why we are where we are today in the complete mess that American comics are in, because they've done things to these characters that are indelible, changed their continuities forever. They've made them more quote unquote mature, and they're not really mature, which is weird. I mean, come on. These characters wear skin tight outfits and masks and capes and boots and gloves and fly around and stuff like that. It's fetishistic to make them more mature. It's weird to make them more mature. I think Watchmen had the opposite effect that Alan Moore wanted it to have. I think he was showing how it would be wrong to grow these characters up. And everybody thought it was, hey, this is really cool. We're going to grow all the characters up. And I once said to someone a few years ago that you can't have these characters mature along with you. I mean, what are you going to have someday? You're going to have Batman using a walker because, you're in your 60s or 70s still reading comic books. And they're like, oh, that's ridiculous. I'm like, well, and my answer then was the same one I have now. Really? Is it ridiculous? Because look what they put these characters through. Marrying them, having them have kids, having them have all these different problems, having them peeing their pants. I mean, it's, they've broken so many of these characters down and basically left nowhere for an entry level. No kid is going to pick up these comics and start reading them because they're not for them anymore. The continuity is so dense and has passed them by, with decades of stuff created in canon and one crisis after another and one derivation after another. I mean, there's so many different Spider-Men. There's so many different variations of all these different characters. It's impossible to find a place where to begin. And because these comics are made to appeal to an ever shrinking and rapidly shrinking fan base. So, so there you go. that's what happened. And that's why it was wrong to do so. But creatively, easy. Unknown passenger 44025. Which writers influenced your voice? Oh, which writers influenced my voice? Oh, man. This is a tough one. I don't think anybody, you hear Batman's voice in your head. And I don't think a writer influenced. It's like, when it's wrong. When Batman's speaking too casually. Batman speaks somewhat formally, partially to hide his Bruce Wayne identity. So he speaks probably a lot more formally than Bruce Wayne does, which is the way I wrote it. So he doesn't have a very distinctive voice, I wouldn't think. And, he's gone through different permutations where he's been, gruff and dark, and then other times where he's kind of like a dad. But I think over the years, my default setting for Batman in my head is Clint Eastwood. Not because I don't hear Clint Eastwood's voice, but I hear his meter and his pacing and his choice of words when he was playing his more serious characters. This is a no nonsense, no BS kind of guy that Batman is. And so it's like, if I can't hear Clint Eastwood saying the line, it's wrong. And this is like deep, deep in my psyche. It's not, I don't consciously draw forth Clint Eastwood, but in my head, if Clint Eastwood could say this line, it would sound cool, then it's a good line for Batman. So no writer really influenced my voice because Batman's voice is pretty consistent throughout his run. I don't know what he's talking like now. I've seen some pages that are just, well, that's not Batman. He would never say that crap. So yeah, so Clint, and and as Richard Nixon said of Clint Eastwood can do no wrong. So. Joshua Ignatowski. I think that some major areas where Star Wars prequels failed to be as enjoyable to audiences as films from the original trilogy were in the script writing. I talked about Star Wars a couple of videos ago, namely how scenes were structured and how the dialogue was written, as well as the pacing. And that if those three aspects of the films were done similarly enough to the way they were in the first films, their mass enjoyability would go up by a lot. So my question is, what do you think made the pacing, the way the dialogue was written, and the way the scenes were structured so ever-loving and enjoyable in the first Star Wars films? And how might an armchair quarterbacking script reviser emulate the way they were done? I'm sure your vast script writing experience for comics can lend you some keen insights. Well, I think everybody knows that the original Star Wars, particularly the first two films, extremely derivative of other film genres. And that's not to put them down. Star Wars is the first, especially the first film, is practically a history of Hollywood. It's got everything but the kitchen sink in it. It's got almost every Hollywood trope you can think of, and beyond Hollywood. Spielberg is borrowing from John Ford, Howard Hawks, Raoul Walsh, Akira Kurosawa. I mean, he's just taken everything, every movie he ever saw in film school, every movie he ever saw as a kid, every movie he ever watched on late night TV, and he's distilling down everything he liked about it and leaving everything else out. So a lot of the dialogue in Star Wars would be very much at home in a Clark Gable, Spencer Tracy movie. Very much at home in a 40s movie or a 50s movie. And that's a lot of the charm of it. That's the escapist portion of it. It's movie dialogue. And some of it's not so easy to act, which is where Lucas gets into trouble. And Empire Strikes Back to me is the epitome. This has so many terrific touches in it that come from other films. Bogart and Bacall. The great adventure films. Pirate movies. Whatever you can think of, it's all here. All these influences are here, and this is the high watermark. for Star Wars. Everything else from here is downhill. And when I saw Empire Strikes Back, I was so freaking excited. I was a huge Star Wars fan already because this was awesome. And it was directed by a guy, Irvin Kershner, experienced Hollywood pro who knew how to direct actors. And he knew how to take this dialogue and make it work, where Lucas never did. I'll get into that in a minute. But what these films had was everything. Like I said, it borrowed from everywhere in Hollywood's history. And the biggest thrill for me was Han and Chewie. These sort of outlier characters who enter the plot line. And they're like the coolest guys in the film. And they're and every scene they're in is like part of a buddy movie, you know, and they're unpredictable. They're the wild card in the movie. I mean, when I first saw Star Wars, I was so wrapped up in that movie that I really thought that Han Solo was saying goodbye for good at the end. I mean, I checked my brain at the door, and I was totally naive. I was a child again watching this movie at age 27, I think, and just bought that we wouldn't see Han again. So that's why, I mean, so all of that just works so perfectly, and there's humor there, not comedy but humor. And when Lucas goes to put that in the prequels, when he tries to get a little bit of that going in the prequels, his answer is Jar Jar Binks. Probably the most hated character. Well, around my house, the Ewoks are the most hated character, but the most hated character in Star Wars is Jar Jar Binks, because it's such a naked attempt to bring comedy into a series where comedy had no place. Humor, yes, you know, but he didn't have C-3PO and R2-D2 and their little, you know, Jeez and Wooster act, and they didn't have Han and Chewie, so they replace it with this character, unlikable, stupid, and just doesn't work. It didn't help either that he was a totally 100% CGI character, improperly handled, and just a mess. And again, this goes back to Lucas's inability to direct actors. Empire Strikes Back, they had Irvin Kershner showing them the way and working with them. So there's some brilliant performances in Empire Strikes Back. In Star Wars, all the actors are left to their own devices to hold their own. God bless Carrie Fisher. She starts the movie with an English accent and ends it with, you know, Southern California surfer girl. Obviously no direction from Lucas on how to do this. She's completely on her own. And you've got to hand it, should have won an Academy Award for convincingly delivering the line, I knew there was more to you than just money. Or she has a line like that. We all know that line. You know, there was more to you than money, to Han when he returns. What an awful line. Because it's so on the nose. But she delivers it well. You know, and all the other actors. I mean, when you watch the film, I watched it on IMAX, Star Wars on IMAX when they re-released it just before the first editions, the special editions, and I hadn't seen it in years, and I had forgotten how whiny Mark Hamill sounds most of the time in the movie. I mean, it's just not a patch on the performances that he would give later in Empire and Return of the Jedi. He's awesome in Return of the Jedi. He does an awesome acting job in that. Not so much Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford really phones it in. Return of the Jedi. He's sick of this franchise. He wants out. But the check was nice. So here we go with the prequels, and it's Lucas directing. And some of the casting choices, and then again, acting. He's not directing the actors well. And everybody's so damn serious. I mean, this kid was just, maybe with a better director, he would have had a chance. But he's just awful. Every single one of his line readings is high school play, or I should say elementary school playtime. Just bad. I'm not blaming the kid, because he should have had some direct. Hayden Christensen runs into the same problem. He's an adult man, and he's running into problems. And it's just like this serious tone. We've lost the lighthearted romp feel. and Jar Jar Binks is supposed to carry all of the humor on his back. It doesn't work. And the three prequels get, I mean, obviously with the story is getting very, very serious. The downfall of Anakin Skywalker, the transformation into Darth Vader. It's, yeah, we're going to get serious there, but come on, give us a few. There should have been an equivalent of Han Solo in there, some kind of outlier character that we could relate to, because I'll get into that in a minute. And then the romance. The romance, again, probably would have been better with a better director or a better actor-director. I'm not going to say Lucas is a bad director. He's a terrible actor-director. This romance would have worked better if these two had been given a chance with a director that would listen to them. Now, in the third film, there's the scene with Palpatine where Anakin basically comes over to the dark side. This scene, of all the scenes in all the prequels, is the best acted. It really is an effective scene. And it doesn't rely on special effects or anything else. It relies simply on the relationship, the dynamics between these two characters. And I got to think that, was it Ian whatever that guy's name is, the guy that plays Palpatine. I got to think he coached Hayden Christensen. I got to think that they went out to dinner together, or they had some workshop time to work out exactly how to do the scene, because this is not Lucas. I'm telling you, this is not Lucas's effect that made the scene work. And I think both actors realized, wow, if this scene doesn't work, this whole thing falls flat on its face, because this is the transition. This is the moment when Anakin moves to become one of the Siths, and the Sith. There's no plural. And it was so important that this scene work, and it really is an effective scene. And I say that the actors, it's obviously not Lucas's direction. The other thing wrong with the prequels is it's too damn much politics. Couldn't they have simplified this? What is this about? Trade agreements? There's, snarky little asides about Ronald Reagan and lowering taxes, tax cuts. I mean, none of it makes any sense. There's too much time spent on it. Couldn't they have come up with what brings the Republic to its knees and what makes them turn to a tyranny is some external threat, maybe from a different part of the galaxy, an invasion of some kind, something more realistic, more relatable, other than I just hate movies that have sci-fi politics. And all the people have weird names, and we're supposed to believe and understand and relate to this. And it's why I don't like Dune. I don't like Foundation, because I get enough politics in my life here in the real world, living on Earth. I don't need to see a bunch of guys, a bunch of elites arguing. I want to know how the day-to-day people live. I want to know more about that guy at the diner with the 4 arms and the meat cleavers. I don't want to know about these people. I don't want to know what they're doing. I mean, they should have come up with a cleaner, more relatable, more action-oriented motivation for everything that goes on. My other problem with the prequels is there's too damn many Jedi. Come on. I don't care what kind of Star Wars fan you are. Come on, admit it. Admit it. Jedis are boring. The most boring part of any Star Wars movie is the Jedi crap. I mean, Empire Strikes Back is wonderful. Story grinds to a halt when Luke gets to Dagobah and they start talking about the Force and Jedi stuff. This grinds. As much as they try to make it interesting, it just isn't. This is a big pack of Mary Sues. They're too serious. They're too humorless. They just think a whole lot of themselves. And they're bores. And that's everything that's been wrong with Star Wars from the prequels on. Because I haven't seen any of the sequels, and I probably never will unless I'm like strapped down and forced to watch them. But looking at a distance, they all seem to be very much involved with everything Jedi. I mean, there's Jedi in all the titles, and there's the Force and Jedi and blah, 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 blah. The only Star Wars recent film I've seen is Rogue One, which I enjoyed. And you know what it didn't have a lot of? Jedis. It was more of an sci-fi action-adventure story, which is what Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back promised us the entire series was going to be. you know, more Han and Chewie, less Luke. And that's what I wanted. So that's the problem. It's not just pacing. It's a lot of the subject matter, the poor acting direction, and the emphasis on things that simply aren't important. That isn't to say that I wouldn't rewatch the prequels someday. There's some really cool stuff in them, some really terrific action set pieces. But overall, as a story, to me, it just falls flat, which is terrible because the core story is awesome. I mean, the fall of Anakin Skywalker, how Darth Vader's origin. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that part of the story. It's just how they put it together. Just seems like a great big mess to me. J. Tally Hang. J. Haley Tang. I've noticed P.G. Woodhouse has come up a couple of times in your videos. I've been meaning to get into his books ever since I saw the Fry and Laurie version of Jeeves and Wooster. Ever since finding out he was a major influence on Douglas Adams, which Woodhouse is a major influence on a lot of things. Practically created the romantic comedy that we see today. I'm adding, obviously, here. Anyway, I have one compilation book, Nothing But Woodhouse, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I haven't seen that one. There's a lot of different compilation books. I don't know what was collected in there, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But I don't know where to go next. What are your recommendations? You got to read Right Ho Jeeves. I think everybody that likes P.G. Woodhouse acknowledges that this is his absolute masterpiece. It's a Jeeves and Wooster story, obviously. I've adapted it along with Gary Kwapis into a graphic novel at Arkhaven. Still buy it on Amazon. And it's just everything you want in a Jeeves and Wooster story. Some of the funniest, sustained comedic sequences ever to appear in prose. And terrific lines. So terrific standalone takeaway lines. Just brilliantly delivered by Birdie and Jeeves. The classic Gussie Finknottle giving an address at a boys' school while high as a kite on spiked orange juice is fantastic. And the story just moves from one strength to another. So if I was to read any Woodhouse, that would be the one. I really like the Mr. Mulliner collections. They're short stories told by Mr. Mulliner, who shows up at his local pub each evening and tells the people there a story about one of his relatives, be it a nephew or an uncle or a cousin. And there's comedy gold in each one of these. Each one has a unique setup. I love the language. There's a couple of them about people who are writers. There's a couple dealing with Hollywood. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But I really like the Mr. Mulliner stories. There's a number of anthologies, and they're worth checking out. There's also an excellent on audiobook, an excellent dramatized BBC version of these stories. They're very, very accurate retellings of the Mr. Mulliner stories. They don't lose anything in translation to dramatic reading that you might want to check out. Funny stuff. I don't play golf, but I love reading Woodhouse's golf stories. And as Woodhouse says in one of his introductions, that he writes light and airy and inconsequential romantic comedies, but he said that of all the things he's ever written, his stories about golf are the only ones written in blood. Because Woodhouse is a very serious golfer, and he uses a lot of tragic elements to make you laugh, things that would probably horrify avid golfers appear in these stories, and just funny stuff. Terrific recurring characters, like the old member. The old member is an old guy who sits around on the lawn at the country club and reminisces about past golf games. And the thing about it is, and Ian Fleming must have been a big student because he spent 3 chapters of Goldfinger depicting a golf game. He must have been a student of Woodhouse, because Woodhouse is able to make, I don't play golf, as I said. He is able to describe these golf games and make them suspenseful, which that's a master writer. If they can get you engaged in a sport you're not interested in, make you understand it, make you understand the stakes, make you understand what's going on, and get you totally involved in the game itself, the fictional game they're playing themselves. Now, a standalone novel of his that I really like is called Laughing Gas. And as far as I know, this is the first switching identities novel ever. Woodhouse uses the high concept of an adult man, an English nobleman, switching places, switching bodies with a Hollywood actor who's a child star. And it's a really funny novel, and it goes into an area of culture that Woodhouse loved to mock, and that's anything Hollywood. Because Woodhouse spent a year at MGM under contract to Irving Thalberg, and he said it was the most miserable year of his life. It was even more miserable than when he was held as a POW by the Nazis. Because he was basically trapped. They never used any of his work. He was very critical of the Hollywood process. And here in Laughing Gas, he has a lot of fun with the studios and actors and things like that. And it's weird because it's like a Freaky Friday story. It's a body switching story, and it may be the first one ever. Maybe one of you out there would correct me and know of an earlier one. But yeah, those are my Woodhouse recommendations. And of course, there's Blanding's Castle, but that's a whole thing. That's like Lord of the Rings. You got to dive into the Blanding's Castle stories because there's lots of anthologies that are just Blanding's Castle and a ton of novels. So I would visit the ones I recommended first, and then if you still love Woodhouse, dive into the Blanding's Castle. I mean, it's rewarding, but they're dense, and there's a lot of continuity involved in them, more so than any of his other recurring characters, like Uckridge or Jason Wooster. John Morgan Batneal, at last. Frankly, I've been wanting to know your thoughts on the Devil's Brigade for ages and Hogan's Heroes. Well, let's go right into the nerdiest weeds imaginable. Yes, I talked about Dirty Dozen recently, and John wants to know about the Devil's Brigade. Devil's Brigade was a movie that was rushed into production to take advantage of the enormous box office that Dirty Dozen was doing. And it's basically the same kind of misfit special mission. They take a bunch of Americans who, are like losers and yardbirds, and they unite them with this Canadian group of Canadian like elite soldiers for a special mission behind German lines. And it's no Dirty Dozen. I don't like this movie at all. I find it tedious and tiresome. Apparently most of the people appearing in it find it tedious and tiresome. William Holden looks like he wishes he was in any other movie. When you've got a movie with Vince Edwards in the main credits, you're not looking for A quality entertainment. Poor Cliff Robertson, Claude Akins, a bunch of British actors playing Canadians. It's a pretty tepid mess, and it's directed by Andrew V. McLaughlin, who was an okay director, but he's not really straining himself here. This just is no Dirty Dozen. I don't like this movie. I'm sorry, John, if you wanted me to say I liked it, or maybe you wanted me to share your hatred for it. But I tried to watch this. I watched it a couple of years ago again, thinking, well, let me give it another chance. And then I thought, okay, I'm making a personal promise to myself. I'm never giving this movie a chance again. Now, I want the Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes, for me, it's a very personal thing because my dad loved this show. He loved this show. Our local television station in Philadelphia ran Hogan's Heroes every day at 1 PM. And my dad, once he retired, he arranged his day around the Hogan's Heroes rerun at 1 PM. He ate lunch watching Hogan's Heroes. He loved Hogan's Heroes. When Hogan's Heroes first aired, my dad was working like 2 jobs. My dad was a total workaholic. He worked 16 hours a day, every day, and roofed on the weekend. He had his own roofing business on the weekend. And so he wasn't going to be home on Friday night to see Hogan's Heroes. But he read about it, and he said, I would really want to see that because it was about Army Air Corps guys in a prisoner of war camp. And he had been in the Army Air Corps, and he just thought it looked like a fun show. So he would have my mother and I watch it on Friday night. And when he got home from work, we would have to tell him what happened. And this is a show he had never seen. We would have to tell him. We'd have to describe the characters to him, and he got to know the characters who was retelling these stories to him. And then finally, they moved Hogan's Heroes to Saturday night, and he was able to watch the show. But just a huge fan. Now, how do I feel about it? I got a lot of affection for it because of my dad. Loved it so much. This show got some criticism when it first came on because they thought it was too arch. It was taking World War II too lightly, which if you watch the show, it really doesn't. It really doesn't. The Nazis come in. Well, not the Nazis. The Luftwaffe comes in for a lot of ribbing. Hogan kills a lot of Nazis die on this show. So in a very dim view, the show could get grim at times amidst all the canned laughter. But I like it because I like service comedies. I'm a big, a genre that does not exist anymore, the service comedy. And the appealing thing about the service comedy is the same thing that's appealing about like a high school comedy is it's anti-authority. In this case, it's Hogan versus, his captors, the Germans. And those are the authority figures he's against. But in most service comedies, it's the enlisted man versus the officers, or a conniving officer against the other officers. Whatever way, they're anti-authority and they're working against the system. And I mean, that's why I'm a huge fan of Sergeant Bilko. Bilko's a con artist, a con man, a gambler, a grifter, a bit of a heel. He's not likable, yet he's lovable. And very much it's him versus the army. Not in a mean way. He's just grifting. He can't help taking advantage of the situation he's in. Same thing for McHale's Navy. Huge influence on me as a kid. Loved the series when I was a kid. And again, it's a crew of misfits trying to fight the war to the best of their ability, despite the interference of their incompetent superior officers. But again, anti-authority story, which was a lot of fun. And I'm also a big fan of the Ensign O'Toole, which only ran for one season, but back then one season was 32 episodes, about a peacetime Navy, Dean Cain playing an ensign aboard a destroyer escort, and all the hijinks and trouble that he gets into as he connives and schemes, much in the way that Bilko did. But this is like a Navy version of Sergeant Bilko. And it was a fun show, often silly, but that's a service comedy for you. And so there you go. Hey, if you have a question, if you have something you love and you'd like to hear if I love it too, or you have something you hate and you'd like me to share the loathing with you, contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com. You can leave comments here. You can DM me. You can go to Facebook. You can go to Twitter. But this is the most reliable way because I check this all the time. I am not going to miss your question if you go to brunobookstore@gmail.com. And just to remind you, I got a Conan book out. Second book is on its way. Third book, I'm getting near the downslope on the third book. I'll be done the third book in the next couple of weeks. So my Conan trilogy will be complete, and I'll probably write some more after that. But this is seems to be a hit with the readers, hit with the critics, and I'm proud of how well received it's been. And if you want to check it out, you can go to Archaven. I'll have the link below. And Archaven, if you buy it from Archaven, you not only get the paperback, you get the ebook as well, included for the same price. So anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for liking and subscribing and all the other wonderful things you do. And thanks again for your excellent questions. That's what makes this show fun. Nice little community we got going here and growing bigger. We're past 7,000 subscribers. And let's hit 8,000 soon. Tell your friends. They might enjoy a bit of geekiness in their life once a week. All right. So that's it for me. See you all down the road.